contact with the Beach Boys at all these days?
Not at all. No, I don't like Mike Love at all. Because I don't like his attitude is too egotistical.
Brian Wilson and Mike Love, two names forever tied to the rise of the Beach Boys and also to one of the most bitter feuds in rock history. But behind the sunny harmonies was a relationship filled with tension, control, and years of resentment. Before his health took a turn, Brian finally opened up about what really went wrong and why he could never truly forgive Mike. Join us as we uncover the hidden conflicts, private fallouts, and the moment Brian Wilson revealed the truth about why he hated Mike Love. Surf, fame, and friction. In 1961, in the quiet suburb of Hawthorne, California, a group of young family members and friends came together to form what would become one of America's most famous bands, the Beach Boys. At the heart of the group was Brian Wilson, a shy but musically gifted teenager who had a deep love for harmony and songwriting. Joining him were his younger brothers, Dennis and Carl Wilson, their cousin Mike Love, and Brian's high school friend Al Jardine. The group didn't start out with dreams of stardom. At first, they just wanted to make music together. Dennis, the only real surfer in the group, suggested they write a song about surfing. Brian and Mike got to work, and with a little help from the rest of the group, they recorded their first single, Surfin', in late 1961. It became a surprise local hit, eventually landing on the national charts. Encouraged by the response, the group signed with Capitol Records in 1962. From there, things moved quickly. Their early music was simple and fun, with catchy melodies and lyrics that painted a bright picture of California beach life, surfboards, hot rods, and high school romance. Songs like Surfin' Safari and Surfin' USA captured the imagination of young listeners across the country. These early hits were co-written by Brian Wilson and Mike Love. Brian would often come up with the melodies and music, while Mike helped craft the lyrics and added his distinctive vocal style. The blend of Brian's musical ideas and Mike's focus on the themes that kids loved helped the songs connect with a wide audience. Things were still good for now, but the cracks were beginning to show, and soon the real challenges would start. Brian takes control. By 1964, the Beach Boys were one of the most popular bands in America. They had a string of hit songs and had built their image around sunny California life, surfing, fast cars, and fun in the sun. But while their success looked smooth on the outside, things were starting to change behind the scenes, especially for Brian Wilson. Brian had always been the creative center of the group. He wrote the songs, arranged the harmonies, and produced the records. But the pressure of constant touring, writing, and recording was starting to wear him down. He began having panic attacks and struggled with his mental health. In December 1964, during a flight to a concert, Brian had a breakdown and decided he couldn't keep touring. The band supported his decision, and for a short time, Glenn Campbell filled in for Brian on stage. Soon after, Bruce Johnston was brought in permanently to play bass and sing Brian's parts during live shows. While Brian stepped away from performing, he threw himself into the studio. This time away from the road gave him space to focus completely on music. He began writing more personal and emotional songs, moving away from the beach and car themes that had made the group famous. Albums like The Beach Boys Today and Summer Days showed a clear change. The music was more thoughtful, with richer arrangements and deeper lyrics. To bring these new sounds to life, Brian started working with a group of top Los Angeles session musicians known as the Wrecking Crew. These players were skilled professionals who had worked on many hit records. Brian used them to record the backing tracks for Beach Boys songs, while the rest of the band would later add their vocals. This gave Brian more control over the sound he wanted. The songs became more layered and musically complex. He experimented with new instruments, unusual chords, and intricate harmonies. While Brian was growing creatively, not everyone in the band was happy with the changes. Mike Love, in particular, started to feel uneasy. He had always been focused on what fans wanted and what would sell. Mike believed the band's strength came from their feel-good, easy-to-understand songs. He worried that Brian's new direction might be too strange or too serious for their audience. Songs like Please Let Me Wonder and Let Him Run Wild were more emotional and didn't fit the usual Beach Boys image. Behind closed doors, disagreements began to happen more often. Brian wanted to push the band into new artistic territory, while Mike wanted to keep things simple and familiar. Their visions for the future of the band were starting to drift apart. Mike didn't understand why Brian was changing a formula that had worked so well. Brian, on the other hand, was tired of writing the same kinds of songs and wanted to be taken seriously as an artist. Things were about to get a lot more complicated as Brian set his sights on his most ambitious project yet, clashing over genius. By 1966, Brian Wilson was fully focused on his work in the studio. While the rest of the Beach Boys continued to tour, Brian stayed home writing and recording music. He had big plans. He didn't just want to make another Beach Boys album, he wanted to make something special, something deeper and more emotional than anything the band had ever done before. That album would become Pet Sounds. Brian worked on Pet Sounds mostly on his own. He wrote the music, arranged the songs, and produced the entire record. He worked closely with lyricist Tony Asher, a jingle writer who helped Brian put his thoughts and feelings into words. The songs they created weren't about surfing or cars. Instead, they were about growing up, falling in love, feeling lost, and trying to find your place in the world. Tracks like Wouldn't It Be Nice, God Only Knows, and I Just Wasn't Made for These Times were thoughtful, emotional, and personal. Mike Love wasn't involved much during the making of Pet Sounds. Since the band was touring while Brian was in the studio, Mike only heard some of the songs after they were mostly finished. When he finally listened to the album, he had strong opinions. He didn't like the direction Brian was taking the group. He reportedly referred to the album as Brian's ego music because he felt it was more about Brian's personal ideas than about what the fans wanted. One song in particular caused serious tension, Hang On to Your Ego. Mike didn't like the lyrics, which were partly influenced by Brian's experimentation with drugs. Mike pushed for changes to the song, and eventually Brian rewrote it and changed the title to I Know There's an Answer. But the disagreement left a mark. It showed how far apart Brian and Mike had grown and how they saw the band's music. When Pet Sounds was released in May 1966, it received a lot of praise from critics and musicians. Many people in the music world saw it as a groundbreaking album. The arrangements were complex, the lyrics were honest, and the harmonies were beautiful. Paul McCartney later called Pet Sounds one of his favorite albums ever. But in the US, the public reaction was mixed. Pet Sounds didn't sell as well as their earlier records. It confused some fans who expected the usual fun and upbeat Beach Boys sound. Even though it had hit singles like Wouldn't It Be Nice and Sloop John B., the album as a whole didn't perform as strongly on the charts. For Mike, this seemed to prove his point. He believed the album was too far removed from what people wanted from the Beach Boys. Brian, however, was heartbroken that his most personal work wasn't fully embraced. Despite the setback, Brian wasn't done pushing boundaries. Right after Pet Sounds, he began work on what would become one of the most famous singles in pop music history, Good Vibrations. Good Vibrations was unlike any song the Beach Boys had ever made. Brian spent months recording it in pieces, trying out different instruments, vocal parts, and effects. He worked in multiple studios and used the Wrecking Crew to lay down the music. The final song included unusual sounds like a theremin, which gave it a strange and exciting feel. The process was long and expensive. It cost around $50,000 to make, which was a huge amount of money at the time. Mike, along with other members of the band, started to worry. He questioned the costs, the time, and the complicated recording sessions. While he was impressed by the final result, the way Brian was working seemed over the top and risky. Mike also worried that fans wouldn't understand the song. But when Good Vibrations was finally released in October 1966, it became a massive hit. It reached #1 on the charts and showed that Brian's creative vision could still lead to huge success. And next, Brian would aim even higher, beginning a project that would push the band and their tensions even further. Smile tears them apart. After the massive success of Good Vibrations in late 1966, Brian Wilson felt inspired to create something even bigger and more ambitious. He began working on a new album he called Smile. This was meant to be a groundbreaking project, an album that would push music forward and prove that the Beach Boys could stand beside the most creative artists of the time. Brian brought in lyricist Van Dyke Parks to help with the words, someone he thought could match his musical ideas with equally imaginative lyrics. From the start, Smile was unlike anything the Beach Boys had ever done. Brian was experimenting with unusual song structures, strange sound effects, and complex vocal arrangements. He was building songs in pieces. recording small sections separately and then planning to connect them later. Tracks like Surf's Up, Heroes and Villains, and Cabin Essence showed how far Brian was willing to go in exploring new sounds and ideas. But not everyone in the band felt the same way. Mike Love, in particular, started raising concerns. He didn't understand the lyrics Van Dyke Parks was writing. Some of the songs had abstract words that didn't seem to make much sense, at least not in a clear, storytelling way. One famous moment happened during a recording session for Cabin Essence. Mike reportedly turned to Van Dyke Parks and asked, "What the F does that mean?" He was referring to the line, "Over and over the crow cries, uncover the cornfield." Parks didn't respond, and the tension in the room grew. Mike's reaction wasn't just about the lyrics. He was worried about the direction the band was going. He felt Brian was making music that was too strange, too risky, and too far removed from what had made the Beach Boys successful. Mike was also upset that Brian wasn't including him in the creative process the way he used to. The partnership they once had, where Brian wrote the music and Mike helped shape the lyrics and themes, was falling apart. The sessions for Smile dragged on for months. Brian kept changing the structure of the songs, re-recording parts, and losing confidence. He was under pressure from the record label, from his bandmates, and from himself. The more criticism he faced, especially from Mike, the more Brian pulled back. His mental health, already fragile, began to decline even more. He started to feel isolated and paranoid, unsure of who he could trust. By mid-1967, Brian gave up on Smile. He shelved the project completely. To fill the gap, the band quickly recorded a simpler album using some of the ideas from Smile. This new album, called Smiley Smile, was stripped down and much more basic. After Smile collapsed, Brian began to pull away from the band more and more. He stopped going to sessions regularly, avoided meetings, and gave up much of his leadership role. The trust that once existed between Brian and Mike, built during the band's early years, was now badly damaged. They were no longer working as a team, and as Brian faded into the background, Mike stepped forward, which only added to the growing conflict between them. Brian falls as Mike rises. By 1968, the Beach Boys were in a tough spot. Their popularity in the US was fading, their music was changing, and inside the band, things were more divided than ever. Brian Wilson, once the group's leader and creative heart, had mostly stepped away. His mental health was declining, and he was using drugs more often. He rarely showed up to recording sessions, and when he did, his behavior was unpredictable. Brian had gone from being the band's guiding force to someone who was barely involved. With Brian retreating, Mike Love began to step into a bigger leadership role. He became more involved in making decisions for the band, especially when it came to public appearances and trying to keep their image alive. Mike wanted to bring the group back to a more stable and familiar place. He believed that returning to simpler, more accessible music would help them regain their popularity. But not everyone in the band agreed with him. In early 1968, Mike traveled to India with the Beatles to study meditation under Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. This trip had a deep personal impact on him, and he became a strong supporter of transcendental meditation. He believed it could bring clarity and peace, not just to himself, but maybe to the group as well. However, his interest in spirituality didn't fix the growing tensions within the band. When he returned, the creative disagreements only continued. As Brian pulled away, Dennis and Carl Wilson began to play bigger roles in shaping the band's music. Dennis, once the band's drummer with little songwriting input, began writing songs that were emotional and raw. Carl, always known for his calm nature and strong voice, also stepped up in the studio. Both brothers had creative ideas that were different from the old Beach Boys sound. Their music leaned toward more experimental and personal themes. This created a new kind of struggle. Instead of one clear leader, the band now had several members pulling in different directions. Mike wanted to stick with the classic Beach Boys style. Carl and Dennis wanted to move forward artistically. Brian, meanwhile, was barely involved, sometimes contributing bits and pieces, but mostly staying isolated. And soon those growing cracks would lead to legal battles, deeper personal rifts, and a feud that was about to go public. Cousins in court. In the early 1970s, the Beach Boys were struggling to stay relevant. Their newer albums weren't selling well, and the group was no longer seen as a major force in music. But in 1974, something unexpected happened. Capitol Records released a greatest hits compilation called Endless Summer. It featured their classic early songs, Surfing, Cars, and California Fun. To everyone's surprise, the album was a huge success. It climbed the charts and stayed there for months. Suddenly, the Beach Boys were popular again. Mike Love saw an opportunity in this. He believed the band's future was in their past, the hits that fans already loved. He pushed for nostalgia-themed tours that focused on the old songs. The concerts were a hit, bringing in large crowds and renewing interest in the band. While Carl, Dennis, and even Brian still had hopes of making new, serious music, Mike argued that playing the classics was what people wanted and what paid the bills. At the same time, Brian Wilson's condition was getting worse. His mental health was fragile, and his drug use continued. He was rarely involved in band decisions or studio work, but with Endless Summer bringing the band back into the spotlight, the idea came up to promote a comeback centered around Brian. In 1976, the band's management launched the Brian's Back campaign. The idea was to show that the band's creative genius had returned and was ready to lead them again. The problem was, Brian wasn't really back. He wasn't healthy, and he wasn't ready. While he did appear at some events and worked on the 15 Big Ones album, it was clear that he was being pushed into the spotlight before he was ready. Brian later said he felt used, treated more like a mascot than a musician. He resented how his name and image were being promoted while he was still struggling behind the scenes. The tension between Mike and Brian continued to grow. While they performed together on stage, behind the scenes, things were falling apart. The biggest blow came in 1977, when Mike Love filed a lawsuit against Brian Wilson. Mike claimed that he had helped write the lyrics for many of the band's early hits, but had never received proper credit or payment for his work. Songs like California Girls, Help Me, Rhonda, and others, Mike said, included his lyrical input, yet only Brian was officially listed as songwriter. The legal battle was long and bitter. Mike eventually won the case and was awarded millions in unpaid royalties. While he felt justified, the lawsuit deeply hurt Brian. Being taken to court by his own cousin added to his feelings of betrayal and isolation. Even though they continued to tour and appear in public together, the damage was done. Brian versus the band. By the 1980s, the Beach Boys were still performing together, but they were no longer functioning like a close-knit band. The group was divided, and the tensions between Brian Wilson and Mike Love were more visible than ever. Much of the conflict during this time centered around Brian's mental health and the growing influence of a controversial figure, Dr. Eugene Landy. In 1983, Brian's family and close associates brought Landy back into his life to help with Brian's serious physical and mental decline. Landy had worked with Brian before, but this time the treatment was far more extreme. Brian was placed under what was called a 24-hour therapy program. Landy moved into Brian's home and controlled who he saw, what he ate, when he slept, and what he worked on. While Brian did show signs of improvement physically, he lost weight and became more active. Many people around him, including members of the band, grew concerned. Mike Love and other members of the Beach Boys began to question how much control Landy had. They believed Landy had too much power over Brian's personal and professional life. More importantly, they were alarmed by the fact that Landy was also making decisions about Brian's music, finances, and business affairs. Landy was now acting not just as a therapist, but as a manager and co-writer. This crossed a line for many, especially Mike, who didn't trust Landy's intentions. Brian, however, defended Landy and felt he was helping him rebuild his life. Under Landy's direction, Brian began working on solo material. This didn't sit well with the rest of the band, especially Mike. For years, they had fought to keep the Beach Boys together, often relying on Brian's name and legacy to maintain public interest. Now, Brian was stepping out on his own, with Landy steering the ship. In 1985, the Beach Boys released a self-titled album, their first without Dennis Wilson on drums. All the remaining members contributed, including Brian, but the creative process was strained. The album had a polished modern sound but lacked the spark of their classic work. While it showed the band could still function together, the collaboration was shaky and full of tension. Then in 1988, the Beach Boys were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It should have been a celebratory moment, but instead, it turned awkward and uncomfortable. During his acceptance speech, Mike gave a rambling and defensive talk. He took jabs at artists like Mick Jagger and Paul McCartney, challenging them to get out and do it like the Beach Boys still were. He also made remarks that hinted at the internal conflict within the band, making it clear that all was not well behind the scenes. Legal nightmares. By the 1990s, the Beach Boys were far from the united group they had once been. Brian Wilson was becoming more distant from the band, rarely performing with them and focusing more on his solo career. His mental health was still fragile, and though he was no longer under the full control of Dr. Eugene Landy, thanks to legal action that had ended their relationship in 1991, Brian was still rebuilding his life slowly and carefully. His connection to the rest of the band, especially Mike Love, remained strained. Meanwhile, Mike Love was becoming the most visible face of the Beach Boys. He had gained greater legal control over the band's touring name and brand, and by the mid-1990s, he was leading a licensed version of the Beach Boys that performed all over the country, often without Brian or the other original members. While Carl Wilson and occasionally Al Jardine were still involved, it was Mike who shaped the set lists and public appearances. The shows leaned heavily into the group's early surf and pop hits, which Mike believed fans wanted most. In 1991, Brian released his autobiography, Wouldn't It Be Nice, My Own Story? The book, however, caused immediate controversy. It included passages that were critical of Mike Love and described him as controlling, uncreative, and dismissive of Brian's more artistic ambitions. Although the book was credited to Brian, it was later revealed that much of it had been written or shaped by his therapist and legal team, while Brian was still recovering from Landy's influence. Mike was furious about how he was portrayed. By the mid-1990s, Mike Love filed a defamation lawsuit against Brian and the book's publishers, claiming the autobiography contained false and damaging statements about him. He argued that the book misrepresented his role in the band's history and hurt his reputation. Brian's team eventually settled the case out of court, but the lawsuit caused even more damage to their already fragile relationship. After years of legal disputes over songwriting credits, this new legal battle deepened the personal divide between the two cousins. In 1998, tragedy struck when Carl Wilson, the band's emotional center and peacemaker, died of lung cancer. His death was a major blow to everyone in the band. Carl had often acted as the one who kept things from completely falling apart. Without him, the emotional balance in the group shifted even more. Al Jardine drifted away from the main touring group, and Brian grew even more private. Back together briefly. In 2011, fans were stunned by an announcement that many thought would never happen. The Beach Boys, Brian Wilson, Mike Love, Al Jardine, Bruce Johnston, and David Marks were reuniting for their 50th anniversary. After decades of personal struggles, lawsuits, and separate touring paths, the original surviving members agreed to come together for a new album and a world tour. For a brief moment, it looked like the past was behind them. The reunion wasn't just symbolic, it was creative too. In 2012, the Beach Boys released That's Why God Made the Radio, their first album with Brian Wilson fully involved in many years. The album was warmly received and even debuted at number 3 on the Billboard charts. It was a proud moment for the band and especially for Brian and Mike, who were finally seen working side by side again in the studio. The album featured heartfelt harmonies and reflected both nostalgia and maturity. For longtime fans, it felt like a long overdue homecoming. Along with the album came a major 50th anniversary tour. The band played over 70 shows across the US and internationally, performing classic hits to large crowds. Brian appeared happy to be back on stage with the group, often smiling and even cracking jokes during shows. Mike took on his usual frontman role, keeping the crowd energized and leading the performances. For a while, the chemistry seemed to work, and the shows were a big success. Then, in late 2012, Mike Love made a surprise announcement. He issued a press release stating that he would continue touring under the Beach Boys name, but without Brian Wilson, Al Jardine, or David Marks. Mike said the decision was purely business, that the reunion tour had always been planned as a temporary event, and that he had long-standing agreements in place to continue touring with his existing band. Brian, however, was shocked. He told the media that he was blindsided by the news and had hoped to keep working with the group. He said he never expected the reunion to end so suddenly. Al Jardine also expressed frustration, saying he felt pushed aside just when the group had found its footing again. The media quickly picked up the story, framing it as another chapter in the long-running feud between Brian and Mike. Fans debated who was at fault, and online discussions were heated. Mike defended himself in interviews, saying he had been unfairly attacked and that journalists were always eager to paint him as the villain. He insisted he had followed all legal agreements and that keeping the Beach Boys touring was his way of honoring the music. Even after the success of the reunion, the peace didn't last, and once again, the deep personal divide between Brian and Mike was back in the spotlight. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss more deep dives into music's biggest stories.